Hi, I'm Mrs. Taylor. I've been teaching English literature for, well over 20 years now. You know, when you've stood in front of so many classes, read through countless essays, and discussed everything from The Great Gatsby to Beloved, you start to think you've seen it all. That there's nothing a student can really throw at you that'll surprise you anymore. You think you've got it under control, the classroom, the kids, even yourself. But sometimes, there's a moment that just sticks with you. A moment that shakes you in ways you didn't expect. It might be just one sentence, one question, one look from a student that suddenly makes the room feel different. It's been, 17 years since this happened, and I still remember it clear as day. Sometimes when I'm sitting at my desk after school, the light kind of slanting through the window, it'll just come back to me. Not in a bad way, not anymore. But it changed me. You know, there are stories that teachers like to tell, the funny moments, the sweet ones, the little triumphs. This isn't exactly one of those. This is a story about a mistake I made, one I almost couldn't forgive myself for. A mistake that nearly made me quit teaching right there and then. And the funny thing is, it didn't happen in some big dramatic scene. No one shouted. No one stormed out. It was quiet. Just a student, a question, and me standing there, feeling like the floor had been pulled out from under me. I still get a little nervous thinking about sharing this with people, but I think it's important. Because if you stay in this job long enough, you're going to have moments like this. And maybe hearing mine will help someone else through theirs. So, if you're a teacher, or maybe thinking about becoming one, or honestly, even if you've ever just wondered what it's really like on the side of the desk, stick with me for a bit. I'm going to tell you about the lesson I'll never forget. And hey, while you're here, if you've ever had one of those moments that just stuck with you, that made you question everything, leave me a comment. I'd love to hear about it. And if the story connects with you, go ahead and hit that like button or subscribe. I've got a few more tales to share. All right, let me take you back. Junior year, 11th grade English. A regular Tuesday morning. I walked into class thinking it'd be just another day. I had no idea that by the end of that hour, everything would feel different. You know, sometimes when people find out I've been teaching for so long, they ask me, why literature? Why English? And honestly, it was never about the grammar rules or making sure kids use the Oxford comma. It was always about the stories. The way a good book can pull you into another world, make you feel something, make you see something new, or maybe see yourself in a way you hadn't before. I guess you could say I fell in love with that feeling back in college. I wasn't one of those kids who always knew they wanted to be a teacher. Not at all. In fact, I started out thinking I'd go into publishing or maybe journalism. But then, during my senior year, I did some volunteer tutoring at a local high school, and something clicked. I still remember the look on one student's face when we read To Kill a Mockingbird together and talked about courage, empathy, standing up for what's right. That moment stuck with me. It made me realize that teaching wasn't just about delivering information. It was about helping young people connect with ideas, with each other, even with themselves. After that, the rest is history. I went back, got my teaching certification, and started my first year at this very same high school here in Pittsburgh. It wasn't glamorous. We had old desks, chalkboards with cracks in them, those flickering fluorescent lights that gave everyone a weird complexion. But it was mine, my classroom, my space. And the students, they kept me on my toes, that's for sure. Pittsburgh's an interesting city. You've got this mix of blue-collar families, tech folks coming in, old neighborhoods, new developments, and that shows up in the kids. Every classroom here is like a little microcosm of the city. Different backgrounds, different stories, different voices, and I loved that. It kept things real. Over the years, I built a bit of a reputation. I wasn't the easy teacher, not by any means. I held my students to a high standard. I expected them to think, to question, to dig deeper. But I also cared about them fiercely. I knew their stories, their struggles, their strengths. I made it my mission to make literature feel alive for them. Not just words on a page, but something that mattered to them, here and now. Personality-wise? Well, I'm probably what you'd call reserved. I'm not one of those bubbly, hey kids, types. I'm more the steady, calm presence in the room. I listen a lot, and when I speak, I mean it. I don't believe in wasting words, but I do have a dry sense of humor and I'm passionate about what I teach. You'd often find me after class, still talking with students about some scene from Of Mice and Men or debating the ending of The Scarlet Letter. I love those moments. The small ones, the quiet ones. They felt meaningful. Of course, after 20 years in the profession, you start to think you've developed a thick skin. That you've seen it all, the good, the bad, the difficult days, the breakthroughs. I thought I had a pretty good handle on my job, my students, even myself. I thought I knew what to expect when I walked into that classroom each morning. But as I learned that day, sometimes life has a way of surprising you. And sometimes it's in those surprises that you really find out who you are. It was a crisp Tuesday morning in October, one of those days when the air in Pittsburgh has just that slight edge of coolness, and the leaves are turning gold and red, ready to drift down onto the sidewalks. I arrived at school around 7:30, like I always did, clutching my travel mug of coffee and my well-worn tote bag overflowing with papers to grade. The hallway was already starting to buzz, lockers clanging, students chattering about last night's football game, the scent of burnt toast drifting from the cafeteria. I remember thinking, oh my God, another ordinary day, and I slipped into room 214, flipped on the overhead lights, and arranged my desk just so, pile of essays on The Great Gatsby to my left, a stack of handouts on symbolism for today's discussion to my right. By 8 o'clock, my juniors were filing in. Sophia, always the early bird, gave me a quick grin and a wave. Marcus, the class clown, fumbled through his backpack, searching for a pencil, offering his trademark goofy apology. Sorry, Mrs. T, my brain's still asleep. And then there was Elena, quiet, thoughtful, eyes always fixed on mine when we talked about lit. She slid into her seat by the window, pulled out her notebook, and gave me that little nod she gives when she's ready to dive in. It felt like any other morning, that familiar mix of energy and nerves, the promise of stories waiting to be uncovered. I started the bell ringer, a short prompt about how the concept of the American dream shows up in modern media, and the kids bent over their papers, pens scratching. I glanced around, feeling that warm buzz of connection. You know that feeling when you look out at a room full of faces and you think, this is why I do this? I had it then. About 15 minutes in, after we wrapped up the bell ringer and before launching into my lecture on the crucible, I noticed something shifting in the room. It was subtle, just a flicker in Marcus's expression, a pause in Sophia's pen scratching. And then it happened. The fire alarm started to beep, just a soft, single note, like a warning. My heart jumped. I thought we might have a drill, but the noise didn't stop, it echoed, louder this time, a pulsing warning that sent a ripple through the classroom. Marcus looked up, eyebrows raised. Elena's notebook snapped shut. I stood up, my heart pounding, and walked to the corner where the alarm box was mounted. A tiny, red light was blinking, but there was no smoke, no sign of danger. I called out, everyone, stay calm, let's see what's going on. But as I spoke, the alarm began to speak back, a croaky voice over the PA. This is a lockdown. Stay in your classroom. Lock all doors. My breath caught in my throat. A lockdown? In room 214? In my classroom? My usually steady voice tremored as I said, lock the doors. Now. Sophia scrambled to push the chair against the door. Marcus slid the bolt, and Elena pressed herself against her desk, eyes wide. I can still hear the click of those locks, feel the weight of that moment, the students looking at me, waiting, trusting me to tell them what to do next. I swallowed hard, my mind racing. Was it a drill gone wrong? A false alarm? But I remembered Mrs. Henderson down the hall saying something about a real threat, an intruder on campus. Suddenly the classroom felt smaller, the air heavier. I moved to the window and peered out the glass, seeing the hallway deserted, the lights flickering. My hands were shaking and I could feel every single heartbeat. I turned back to the students, trying to muster that calm authority I always prided myself on. "Okay," I said, my voice a whisper but firm, "we're safe in here. We'll stay quiet. I'll text the office now." And in that instant, I realized I've never felt more responsible for a group of teenagers in my entire life. That's the day it all began, the day my classroom transformed from a place of lively debate into a silent fortress, and one question from a student a few minutes later would turn everything upside down. But for now, in that tense calm, all I could do was stand there, heart racing, and try to hold it together for them. Everything seemed under control for those first few minutes, but then the tension in the room started to twist into something else. My phone buzzed in my pocket when I tried calling the main office, no signal. I glanced at the students, who were all silent, eyes wide, shoulders hunched over their desks as if waiting for a storm to hit. I tried a second time, and my voice in my own head sounded shaky. Come on, but all I got was that spinning wheel of doom on my screen. I felt a prick of sweat on my neck, even though the air felt cold. Then there was a knock on the door, 3 firm raps that echoed like a judge's gavel. At first I thought maybe it was a teacher checking on us, but the knock came again, harder, more urgent. I swallowed, putting a finger to my lips to signal quiet, and inched toward the door, my heart pounding like a drum in my ears. I peeked through the little window slit, and at first I didn't recognize the figure. It was someone in a dark hoodie, face hidden by the shadows, standing there in the hallway that should have been bustling with students changing classes. My stomach dropped. Was it an intruder? A worried janitor? I couldn't tell. If I opened the door and it was someone dangerous, I'd be risking every single student in this room. But if I didn't open it and someone truly needed help, maybe a classmate locked out, maybe a teacher who was hurt, then I'd be failing them. I looked back at Marcus, who was staring at the door with pale lips, and at Elena, whose brow was furrowed so deeply I could see the tension in her forehead. I realized then that they expected me to know what to do. I felt the weight of 2 decades of teaching press down on me, all the times I'd told them to trust me, that I had a plan, that I knew the rules. And now here I was, completely off script. My mind raced. Lockdown procedure. Do not open the door. Remain silent. Await instructions. But what if the PA system is down? What if the intruder is hurt? What if? The question spiraled. I took a breath and whispered, "Everyone, back away from the door. Keep low." Their chairs scraped softly as they moved, and I guided them silently to the corner furthest from the entrance. The hallway lights were flickering now, casting weird, strobing shadows that made me want to close my eyes. I pressed my ear to the door panel, no voices, nothing except my own rapid heartbeat. Somewhere in the distance I thought I heard muffled footsteps, but I couldn't be sure. My throat felt dry, and I was pretty certain my voice would break if I tried speaking out loud. So I pointed to my phone, held it up, and mimed typing, hoping, maybe irrationally, that any sign of life on my screen would trigger a response. Time stretched. I glanced at the clock above the whiteboard. 8:43. 10 minutes ago I'd been talking about Arthur Miller and tragedy, and now I was living one. And through it all there was this swirling dilemma: protect my students by following the protocol, or take a chance and see who was on the other side of that door. I realized I was sweating more, and my shirt clung uncomfortably. I rubbed my palm against my skirt, tried to wipe the clamminess away, but it was no use. The decision loomed. I could almost feel the moment splitting into 2 paths, one where I stayed silent and crossed my fingers that someone would sort this out soon, and another where I opened the door and took control of my own fate. My breath came in short bursts, and I could see Marcus's legs shaking under the desk, feel Elena's gaze burning into mine. I thought about the first day I'd walked into the school as a fresh graduate, confident and idealistic, and how over the years I'd learned that teaching isn't just about lesson plans and grades, it's about the unpredictable rawness of human lives. And in that moment, I realized that this was the ultimate unplanned lesson. My mind went blank for a second, and then, I'll never forget it, my finger hovered over the lock release switch. My pulse was pounding so hard I thought it would break through my chest. And just as I was about to decide, a voice crackled through the PA system, distorted, but unmistakable, all clear. Situation contained. You may unlock your doors. Relief slammed into me like a wave. My shoulders dropped, and I exhaled so loudly the students all jumped. I flipped the bolt back and opened the door to find Mr. Anderson, our assistant principal, standing there with 2 officers behind him. The hallway was alive again with students and teachers rushing by, the normal chaos of a school day, and it felt surreal. I looked back at my class, their faces a mix of confusion and relief, and in that instant I knew that things would never feel the same here for any of us. And that was just the beginning of everything going off the rails that day. I'll never forget the second I walked back into room 214 after the lockdown was lifted. The door clicked open, and the usual chatter of the hallway, shoes scuffing, distant laughter, flooded back in, but inside my classroom it was eerily silent. My students sat frozen, eyes wide, as if they'd been holding their breath the entire time. I closed the door firmly behind me and took a deep breath, trying to shake off the adrenaline still crackling in my veins. "All right," I said, my voice a fraction louder than I meant. Let's pick up where we left off, okay?" I forced a shaky smile and motioned toward the front of the room where my lesson plan lay open. My heart was still racing so hard I could feel the beat in my throat, but I couldn't let them see me unraveling. I cleared my throat. We were talking about the crucible and the idea of reputation, how a single accusation can ruin someone's entire life. I clicked the projector back on, illuminating the slide I'd prepared hours earlier. The kids shifted in their seats, and for a moment I thought we might actually get back on track. And then it happened. Elena raised her hand, steady as a statue, right in the center of the room, and she said, in that calm, clear voice of hers, "Mrs. Taylor, can you explain why you told us to interpret Abigail Williams's motivation as purely vengeance? Because in my reading, I saw more complexity, like maybe she believed she was protecting herself or even helping her community." I felt my chest tighten. Abigail Williams, one of the most debated characters in American literature. Of course, there were multiple valid interpretations. I'd planned to guide them toward vengeance as the driving force, but Elena's question cut through the lesson plan like a knife. I opened my mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. All I could hear was the echo of the alarm, the pounding of my own heart, and that overwhelming sense that my carefully constructed narrative was crumbling. I glanced at my notes, my neat bullet points about jealousy, power, fear, but none of it seemed to address what she'd just asked. My mind went blank. I could see Marcus shifting in his seat, eyebrows raised, and Sophia leaning forward, waiting. Every eye was on me. And suddenly I felt exposed, like my identity as a knowledgeable teacher was dangling by a thread. My throat felt dry, and I coughed once, trying to buy time. "Well," I managed, my voice shaky, I think we could also look at it that way. That's a very interesting point." My cheeks heated up, and I could feel the flush creeping down my neck. Elena's gaze held mine, and there was no turning back. My lesson plan lay forgotten. The clock on the wall ticked loudly. I felt panic rising. This was supposed to be my domain, and I was failing right in front of them. And then, in an instant, I heard my own voice in my head. "Don't freeze. Lead." I took a breath, closed my eyes for a split second, and tried to gather my thoughts. "You know," I said, softer this time, "when I first wrote the lesson on vengeance, I was thinking about how accusations can spiral out of control. But you're right, Abigail's actions are layered. She might have believed she was defending her reputation or even fulfilling some twisted sense of justice." I glanced down at my notes, mumbled a rearranged bullet point, and looked back up. Their faces were expectant, hungry for more. I realized in that moment that teaching isn't about having all the answers, it's about guiding the conversation, about admitting when you see something new. And yet, even as I spoke, I could feel the aftershocks of my mistake, the way I'd bluntly positioned vengeance as the only angle, the way I'd almost taught them to see a one-dimensional villain instead of a human being. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I'd let my own bias shape their understanding, and that was more than a slip. It was a betrayal of everything I believed teaching should be. My hands trembled as I clicked to the next slide, and I swear the room went silent again. But then Sophia raised her hand and said, "Thank you for sharing that, Mrs. Taylor. I think it helps to see how complex these characters can be." And just like that, the ice broke. Kids started nodding, some scribbled in their notebooks, others whispered to each other. The class roared back to life, but inside me, something had shifted irreversibly. That question from Elena was the turning point, not just in the lesson, but in my entire career. Because for a moment, I had been so terrified of not knowing, of being wrong, that I almost shut the door on the very curiosity I'd spent 2 decades nurturing. And in that moment of crisis, I learned more about teaching and about myself than I ever had in a textbook. That afternoon, after the bell rang and the hallways burst back into motion, I stayed behind with Elena and a few other students who wanted to continue the discussion. The classroom felt different now, warmer, somehow more honest. I pushed my chair under the desk, leaned forward, and said, "Okay, let's really unpack this. What else did you see in Abigail's choices?" Marcus raised his hand, a tentative smile on his face. I noticed she keeps shifting blame to others like she's afraid of owning her actions. Sophia chimed in, "And her youth. She's what, 15? It's easy to judge, but I felt like she might have been scared, too." The conversation unfolded in that spontaneous, flowing way that makes teaching feel magical. I listened without interruption, nodding, asking follow-up questions, celebrating insights. In that hour, we built a web of interpretations, vengeance and fear, power and vulnerability, reputation and survival. By the end, I looked around and felt genuine pride. It wasn't a perfect discussion. We left some threads dangling, agreed to revisit them next class. But it was honest, collaborative, and alive, and that mattered more than sticking to any script. Later that day, I walked down to the office to apologize to Mrs. Henderson for the confusion during the lockdown. She waved me off with a smile and said, "You handled it like a pro, Taylor. You kept them safe and turned a potential disaster into a real learning moment." Her words felt like a balm to my frayed nerves. I realized that while I'd been beating myself up for my stumble in class, I'd also shown my students something invaluable: how to respond when you don't have all the answers. That evening, I drafted an email to the parents explaining the day's events, offering to meet any family who had concerns. I was transparent about the lockdown, the misstep in my lesson, and how proud I was of the students for coming together. A few parents responded right away, thanking me for the clarity and praising the respectful, thoughtful dialogue their children had at home. Over the next week, our English corridor buzzed not with rumors about the lockdown, but with references to character motives, thematic threads, and, surprisingly, gratitude. Students thanked me for letting them speak up, for valuing their voices. I realized that my mistake had opened the door to a deeper level of trust. In the weeks that followed, I adjusted my lesson plans to include more student-led discussions, more moments for them to challenge both the text and me. My approach became less about delivering knowledge and more about co-creating it. Of course, I still prepared thoroughly. I still had goals for each lesson. But I now embrace the uncertainty as part of the journey. Looking back, I see now that the climax of that day wasn't the lockdown or the near panic. It was that vulnerable exchange over Abigail Williams. That moment of being caught off guard, of admitting imperfection, broke the levee between teacher and students. It reminded all of us, me most of all, that literature, like life, is messy and multi-layered, and that real learning happens when we embrace the unknown. Today, more than a decade later, I still carry that lesson with me. I still get goosebumps when a student dares to ask a hard question, and I still remind myself to pause, listen, and lean into the moment. Because that's where the magic happens. So, if you're watching this and you teach, or if you've ever been in a position where you felt you had to perform, to be the expert, remember, it's okay not to have all the answers. Sometimes the greatest breakthroughs come from the questions we least expect. And with that, I'll leave you with one last thought. What's one question you've been too afraid to ask? Drop it in the comments below. I'd love to explore it with you. I'll be honest, I walked out of room 214 that day feeling a strange mix of relief and lingering tremors in my chest, like my heart was still racing even though the crisis was over. For days afterward, I caught myself replaying that moment over and over, Elena's question cutting through my carefully prepared lecture, the click of that lockdown bolt, the hush that fell like a blanket when I fumbled for words. I remember sitting at the kitchen table that evening, the house quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator, and realizing how much that day had shaken me at my core. It wasn't just about a locked door or a complex character in the crucible, it was about confronting my own fallibility, admitting to a room full of teenagers that I didn't have all the answers. And honestly, that scared me more than any intruder alarm ever could. In the weeks that followed, I felt this undercurrent of vulnerability every time I stepped into the classroom. I found myself pausing more often, giving students the space to challenge me, to push back on an interpretation, to offer their own insights before I jumped in. I still got a little thrill, goosebumps even, when someone asked a question that sent me digging for an answer on the spot. It reminded me that teaching is a living, breathing conversation, not a lecture. On a personal level, I felt humility in a way I hadn't in years. After 2 decades of knowing, I learned again what it meant to be a learner, to sit in that seat of uncertainty alongside my students. It changed how I viewed my role. I became less of a sage on the stage and more of a guide on the side. My lesson plans, once rigidly structured, now included deliberate moments for open-ended discussion, for exploration, for students to lead the way. Outside of school, I found I was a little gentler with myself, too, less critical of every slip-up, more curious about what I could learn from my mistakes. I started journaling again, jotting down not just pedagogical notes, but reflections on how each day's surprises shaped me. I realized that the aftertaste of that day wasn't bitterness or regret, it was growth. It was the reminder that the best lessons in life often come unannounced, in the middle of chaos, when we least expect them. And even now, years later, whenever I feel the faint echo of that alarm in my mind or hear the whisper of a tough question in my ear, I smile. Because I know I'm exactly where I'm meant to be, learning alongside my students every single day. If there's one thing I took away from that day, one lesson that still guides me, it's this. Vulnerability isn't weakness, it's the bridge to real connection. I used to think my job was to have all the answers, to stand at the front of the room as the expert. But that moment when I froze, when I admitted I didn't know exactly how to interpret Abigail Williams, that was the turning point. I learned that when we show our imperfections, we invite others to open up too. I learned that a classroom isn't a stage for performance, but a shared space for exploration where questions can be more valuable than conclusions. To be honest, it was humbling to realize that 20 years of experience couldn't shield me from uncertainty. And you know what? That's a beautiful thing. It reminded me that learning is lifelong, that growth often comes wrapped in discomfort, and that the most meaningful insights emerge when we lean into the unknown rather than shy away from it. From that day on, I stopped hiding behind lesson plans and instead embraced spontaneous dialogue. I stopped pretending I had all the answers and started modeling curiosity, even when it felt risky. And in doing so, I saw my students light up, take ownership of their ideas, and push each other to think bigger. So here's my takeaway. Don't be afraid to be human in your expertise. Admit when you don't know. Celebrate the questions that challenge you. Because in those moments of vulnerability, you create space for genuine understanding, for empathy, and for profound learning. That's the lesson I'll carry with me long after the textbooks close. And I hope it inspires you to welcome uncertainty as your greatest teacher. After that day, word of the lockdown discussion quietly spread through the teacher's lounge and down the hallways, becoming a bit of an in-school legend, though no one ever spoke of it as anything more than a testament to how classroom moments can surprise you. Mrs. Henderson would smile knowingly whenever she saw me, and Mr. Alvarez from the math department would casually reference that moment you let the kids take the wheel whenever I passed him by. It wasn't gossip in a negative sense. It was admiration for how a crisis and a question had transformed a routine lesson into something powerful. In faculty meetings, whenever someone asked how to handle unexpected challenges, I'd find myself sharing that story, not as a cautionary tale, but as proof that authenticity can turn tension into opportunity. As for me, I never experienced anything quite like that again. No more lockdown drills gone sideways. No more moments where I was forced to admit I didn't know the answer. But the impact rippled through every lesson I taught after. I began each semester by telling my students about that day, framing it as a true story of vulnerability and trust. I invited them from day one to challenge me, to question me, and to expect openness in return. My teaching style evolved. I replaced some of my tighter lesson plans with flexible agendas built around student-led inquiry. If a question veered off topic, I embraced it, sometimes improvising on the spot or admitting, "Let's look this up together," rather than gently steering us back to my original outline. This shift didn't just benefit the students, it invigorated me. I rediscovered the joy of exploration, the thrill of not knowing exactly where a discussion might go. Colleagues began asking me to co-teach seminars on discussion-based learning, and I found that sharing my experience helped other teachers feel comfortable stepping outside their comfort zones. Outside the classroom, I started mentoring new teachers, encouraging them to view mistakes not as failures, but as gateways to deeper connection. And over time, I noticed something beautiful. The culture of our schools subtly changed. Classrooms felt more collaborative, hallway conversations more inquisitive, teacher-student relationships more reciprocal. It became understood that teaching is as much about asking the right questions as it is about delivering content, and that demonstrating our own humanity is one of the most effective ways to inspire growth. Now, as I look back on that October morning, I see it not as an anomaly but as the moment that shaped the rest of my career. It taught me that our greatest lessons often emerge in moments of chaos, and that by welcoming uncertainty, we cultivate resilience, empathy, and genuine learning for both teacher and students alike. You've stayed with me through every twist and turn of that unforgettable day, and I hope by now you see that teaching and life is rarely neat or predictable. We plan our lessons, set our objectives, and think we've covered every possible angle, only to be reminded that the real magic happens in the unplanned moments when we dare to admit we don't have all the answers. I shared this story not to showcase a moment of weakness, but to celebrate the power of vulnerability, the way it builds trust, sparks genuine curiosity, and connects us more deeply with the people around us. So here's my final thought for you. When was the last time you let go of the script and embraced uncertainty? Maybe it was in a conversation where you admitted you didn't know, or in a decision you made without having every detail figured out. Did that moment shake you up? Did it lead to something richer or more surprising than you expected? I'd love to hear about it. No judgments, just honest reflections. Drop your story in the comments below, and let's start a conversation about the lessons we learn when we step off the stage and into the real, messy parts of life. What's one question you've been too afraid to ask yourself, and what might happen if you finally gave yourself permission to answer it?